Hey guys, I hope you're all doing really well. I'm Allure Cosplay, and today we break down my Satoru Umezawa Ninjutsu MTG deck. Let's go. Let's start with my commander. This is Satoru Umezawa. He costs 3 to cast. He's a legendary creature, human ninja. Whenever you activate a ninjutsu ability, look at the top 3 cards of your library. Put one of them into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. This ability triggers only once each turn. Each creature card in your hand has ninjutsu 4. This deck has 35 lands. And now for the Planeswalkers. Keito Shizuki costs 3 to cast. At the beginning of your end step, if he entered the battlefield this turn, he phases out. +1, draw a card, then discard a card unless you attack this turn. -2, create a 1/1 blue ninja creature token with this creature can be blocked. -7, you get an emblem with whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, search your library for a blue or black creature card, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle. I also use Soren Markov in this deck. He costs 6 to cast, +2, he deals 2 damage to target creature or player and you gain 2 life. -3, target opponent's life becomes 10. -7, you control target player during that player's next turn. There are only 5 artifacts in this deck. 3 are for mana and 2 are to protect Satoru. There are only 3 sorceries in this deck, 2 of them are tutors and 1 of them is a board wipe. And now let's go over the instance. I have 5 counter spells, a tutor, a board wipe, and a fog. There are 11 enchantments in this deck, starting with Phyrexian Arena. It costs 3 to cast. At the beginning of your upkeep, you draw a card and you lose 1 life. Coastal Piracy. It costs 4 to cast. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to an opponent, you may draw a card. Rhystic Study. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, you may draw a card unless that player pays 1. Mystic Remora costs 1 to cast. Whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, you may draw a card unless that player pays 4. One of my favorites, Dire Undercurrents, costs 5 to cast. Whenever a blue creature comes into play under your control, you may have a target player draw a card. Whenever a black creature comes into play under your control, you may have target player discard a card. Propaganda costs 3 to cast. Creatures can't attack you unless their controller pays 2 for each creature they control that's attacking you. Painful Quandary costs 5 to cast. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, that player loses 5 life unless he or she discards a card. Fallen Shinobi costs 5 to cast. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, that player exiles the top 2 cards of their library. Until the end of turn, you may play those cards without paying their mana cost. Nezahal Primal Tide costs 7 to cast. It can be countered. You have no maximum hand size. Whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, draw a card. Discard 3 cards, exile Nezahal. Return it to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. Blightsteel Colossus costs 12 to cast. It's an artifact creature golem. It has trample and infect. Blightsteel Colossus is indestructible. If it would be put into a graveyard, shuffle it into your library instead. Calidus Assassin costs 6 to cast. It has flash. You may have it enter the battlefield tapped and as a copy of a creature on the battlefield, except it has this creature enters the battlefield, destroy up to 1 other target creature with the same name as this creature. Ingenious Infiltrator costs 4 to cast. Whenever a ninja you control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. Clever Impersonator costs 4 to cast. You may have it enter the battlefield as a copy of any non-land permanent on the battlefield. Silver Fur Master costs 2 to cast. Ninjutsu abilities you activate costs 1 less to activate. Other ninja and rogue creatures you control get +1/+1. Fate Spinner costs 3 to cast. At the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, that player chooses draw step, main phase, or combat phase. The player skips each instance of the chosen step or phase this turn. Inkai Servant of Oni costs 6 to cast. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you may put target creature card from that player's graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. Regenerate for 2. Sakashima's Student costs 4 to cast. You may have the student enter the battlefield as a copy of any creature on the battlefield, except it is still a ninja in addition to its other creature types. Lord of the Void costs 7 to cast. It has flying. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, exile the top 7 cards of that player's library, then put a creature card from among them onto the battlefield under your control. Rexio the Risen Deep costs 6 to cast. It has Island Walk and Swamp Walk. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you may cast target non-instant or sorcery card from that player's graveyard without paying its mana cost. If that card would be put into a graveyard this turn, exile it instead. Ancient Silver Dragon costs 8 to cast. It has flying. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, roll a d20. Draw cards equal to the result. You have no maximum hand size for the rest of the game. Mistblade Shinobi costs 3 to cast. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you may return target creature that player controls to its owner's hand. Jingatax's Core Augur. It costs 10 to cast. It has flash. At the beginning of your end step, draw 7 cards. Each opponent's maximum hand size is reduced by 7. Jingatax's Progress Tyrant costs 7 to cast. Whenever you cast an artifact, instant or sorcery spell, copy that spell. You may choose new targets for the copy. This ability triggers only once each turn. Whenever an opponent casts an artifact, instant or sorcery spell, counter that spell. This ability triggers only once each turn. Thought Cutter Agent costs 2 to cast. If you tap 2, target player loses 1 life and reveals his or her hand. Consecrated Sphinx costs 6 to cast. It has flying. Whenever an opponent draws a card, you may draw 2 cards. Nashi Moonsage Scion costs 3 to cast. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, exile the top card of each player's library. Until the end of turn, you may play one of those cards. If you cast a spell this way, pay life equal to the mana value rather than paying mana cost. Thought Cutter Agent costs 2 to cast. If you tap 2, target player loses 1 life and reveals his or her hand. Consecrated Sphinx costs 6 to cast. It has flying. Whenever an opponent draws a card, you may draw 2 cards. Nashi Moonsage Scion costs 3 to cast. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, exile the top card of each player's library. Until the end of turn, you may play one of those cards. If you cast a spell this way, pay life equal to the mana value rather than paying mana cost. Bella the Nightclad costs 6 to cast. She has Intimidate, and other creatures you control have Intimidate. Whenever this creature or another creature you control leaves the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life. Silent Blade Oni costs 7 to cast. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, look at that player's hand. You may cast a non-land card in it without paying its mana cost. Sakashima the Imposter costs 4 to cast. As it comes into play, you may choose a creature in play. If you do, Sakashima comes in play as a copy of that creature, except its name is still Sakashima the Imposter. It's still a legendary, and it gains tap 4, return Sakashima the Imposter to its owner's hand at the end of turn. Thousand Face Shadow costs 1 to cast. It has flying. When it enters the battlefield from your hand, if it's attacking, create a token that's a copy of another target attacking creature. The token enters the battlefield tapped and attacking. Archon of Cruelty costs 8 to cast. It has flying. When it enters the battlefield or attacks, target opponent sacrifices a creature or a planeswalker, discards a card, and loses 3 life. You draw a card and you gain 3 life. Voidwalker costs 2 to cast. It has Shadow. If a card would be put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, instead exile it with a void counter on it. Sacrifice this card and choose an exile card an opponent owns with a void counter on it. You may play this card without paying its mana cost. Mind Leech Mask costs 8 to cast. It has Trample. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you may look at that player's hand. If you do, you may play a non-land card without paying its mana cost. Hullbreaker Horror costs 7 to cast. It has Flash. This spell can't be countered. Whenever you cast the spell, choose up to 1. Return target spell you don't control to its owner's hand, or return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. Bella the Nightclad costs 6 to cast. She has Intimidate, and other creatures you control have Intimidate. Whenever this creature or another creature you control leaves the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life. Revel in Riches costs 5 to cast. Whenever a creature an opponent control dies, create a colorless treasure artifact token with sacrifice this artifact, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 10 or more treasures, you win the game. Dissipation Field costs 4 to cast. Whenever a permanent deals damage to you, return it to its owner's hand. Tainted Remedy, it costs 3 to cast. If an opponent would gain life, that player loses that much life instead. Cunning Evasion. Whenever a creature you control becomes blocked, you may return it to his owner's hand. And now for the creatures. I have 7 various unblockable 1/1 measly creatures to help me ninjutsu things in. Craido of Boulder's Gate costs 2 to cast. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, that player loses 1 life and mills a card. Then you gain 1 life and scry 1. Whenever you attack, you may pay 2. If you do, target creature can't be blocked this turn. Well, thank you so much for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe for more random nerdy content from me. Don't forget to click the notification button so you know when I upload next. Bye!